Thank you, Paco. It's nice to see everyone. I learned a lot already from a few people speaking before me. I'm in London at the moment. I'm an engineering PhD student. Just finished my PhD in Cambridge, and now live in London. And in my PhD, I worked on sustainable industrial technologies, and climate change and environmental issues have always been my passion. And obviously the American election is key to follow, considering that the US is the second largest CO2 emitter in the world, and historically by far the largest contributor to climate change. So what the US does in terms of climate policy is reflects on the state of the global equilibrium. In terms of policies, there isn't so much to say, in the sense that we all know that Trump has withdrawn from the Paris Agreement, which, if you remember, is an agreement amongst UN countries that was signed in 2015. So that's 5 years ago, to reduce carbon emissions globally, so that global warming is contained within 2 degrees and if possible 1.5 degrees Celsius. And obviously the US being the largest historical emitter, it was expected that it would be that it would set the most ambitious targets for carbon emissions, together with the European Union. And together with China, the country that is currently the biggest emitter. But as Trump came into office in 2016, he is notoriously a climate skeptic, which means he has either said that climate change does not exist, or was invented by the Chinese, or at least is not caused by human activity, and so there is nothing we can do or we should do to change and to stop it. And with the excuse of safeguarding jobs in some key states, he has allowed further oil and gas drilling on public land. He has not given any incentives to sort of closing coal plants. He has made lots of the environmental protection laws that Obama had worked on during his office were rolled back. So it was a pretty horrible 4 years for the climate in the US. But the problem is that because the US is, as we were saying, a geopolitical leader, this has basically, in a sense, given an excuse to China not to act, and also sort of weakened in general the global effort to reduce carbon emissions. Trump's view on the matter hasn't changed. He's not opposed to further oil and gas exploration. He's on for nuclear, for fracking. So if a second Trump presidency becomes reality, I'm afraid there's very little hope for the world, especially because the next sort of 5 to 10 years are key to really start reducing emissions. We've seen now China and the EU's raise their ambitions in reducing emissions. So from a climate standpoint, a Biden win is absolutely necessary. what is Biden proposing is quite interesting, actually, because he was definitely not the Democratic nominee with the most ambitious policies. If you had taken a Bernie Sanders or Warren, they had way more ambitious sort of leftist policies. But after he won the nomination for the Democratic Party, he did sort of englobate a more ambitious plan for the climate. And I'll give you just one number, which is $2 trillion, which is he intends to invest on for the next for the duration of his office. And just to give you a sense, that's twice as much, more than twice as much the whole recovery fund that the EU has put forward for the coronavirus pandemic response. So that's a lot of money, and which is encouraging. And he has promised to rejoin the Paris Accord immediately and reach net zero emissions by 2050. So those are basically putting the US back on track, together with all the other major economies in the world, and then with an ambitious intermediate target of decarbonizing electricity completely by 2035, which is very important because reaching carbon neutrality by 2050 doesn't necessarily guarantee to stay below a safe level of global warming. It matters how far we get there.
While you're on the topic there of carbon neutrality, as they call it,
yeah,
do you just go into a bit of detail on that, because it's a very misleading phrase.
Yeah,
carbon neutral or zero emissions. Can you go into a bit of detail and explain what that actually means?
Yes. So burning fossil fuels emits CO2, which is the main greenhouse gas emissions, which increases the greenhouse gas effect, which is a natural effect that keeps the earth warm. But if you put too much gas, then the air gets too warm, temperature rises, and that has dramatic effects on the climate's equilibrium. So reaching carbon neutrality means we want to reduce carbon emissions, so CO2 emissions, but we recognize that it will be impossible to stop emitting completely. There are some processes that are fundamental to human development, such as making cement and steel, which is extremely difficult to decarbonize. And so given that we still want to emit, or for example, aviation, so electric planes are way far in the future. So aviation will keep emitting for the foreseeable future. And so the idea is that to balance the emissions that we will still be emitting by 2050, we also want to suck emissions from the atmosphere. And this can be done in many different ways. The easiest of which is planting more trees. Trees are carbon sinks. That's usually called afforestation, or more sophisticated technologies, most of which unfortunately are currently not proven at scale, such as bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which is perhaps too complicated to get into at the moment, and other technologies that we believe will be will be effective at scale by 2050, but that's not actually that certain. So it's the idea of having a net balance of zero emissions, but we will still be emitting some CO2 in 2050.
So I have a question. So do you think Biden's policies on climate go far enough? And what more practical steps do you think he can take to offset the damage done by his presidency?
I don't think Biden's policies don't go far enough to keep the temperature below 2 degrees. I think climate change it's to a certain degree, it's not a sort of yes or no situation. It's more like how much warming is there going to be. Scientists have given us a 2-degree limit so that we are sure that the worst effects are avoided, but we don't exactly know what's going to happen after that. So his ambition is not enough to keep us below 2 degrees, but none of the ambitions of the European Union or China or any other country, any other major country in the world are enough for that. His stated ambitions are in line with what the European Union and China are doing, and the fact that he has an intermediate target is quite promising, because it means that he is pressured to do something in his office rather than saying, yes, we will reach carbon neutrality by 2050, but that's 30 years in the future. So there isn't so much to do right now. He hasn't to keep sort of not to avoid alienating some voters in swing states. He hasn't officially said anything against fracking, as Manuel was talking about before. So fracking is a technique to extract natural gas, and in doing so, you release a lot of methane, which is another greenhouse gas emission in the atmosphere, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. So he has to find a compromise between very ambitious leftist policies that satisfy progressives and more pragmatic policies that satisfy labor organizations and the current energy industry. So the major oil and gas players which are still the major companies in the US and globally.
I take small issue with him dooming the planet to basically die is the pragmatic solution. Yeah,
well, yeah. I mean, it's hard to talk about climate change because it's a total paradox. We all live in a total paradox, because we rationally know we are going towards a very gloomy future, but there isn't a...
Oh, Iacopo, save something for later. We
yeah.
need to save the paradox talk for later in the night, maybe.
Yeah. But yeah, I think, yeah, given the current state of politics in the US, I think that's the best we could hope for, I suppose. So
I have a question, if you don't mind. I think one issue that people that I see with climate change is that people see it as a kind of a linear process, is that it maps out like 1 degree equals X amount of badness, 2 degrees equals 2 times X amount of badness. Whereas it's not like that at all. It's kind of, you hit 2 degrees and you're 2.5 and you kind of you pass a point of no return where permafrost will melt and it'll release ridiculous amounts of methane, and then the process it starts feedback loops and it becomes a nonlinear process. Just maybe it just seems when you understand those like nonlinear feedback loops, climate change is much more dire than essentially any other issue. Can you just comment on that? That like, do you agree that that's like a popular understanding of how climate change works? That it's like it's linear and it's actually not. It's got feedback loops.
So I think the modeling of these. So when we make predictions about the future, scientists use models, and they are becoming increasingly sophisticated. But the climate is an extremely complex system. And some of these climatic feedback loops that you're mentioning are very hard to predict. And so I think the scientists who do research on this are still a relatively marginal voice, and it doesn't get into the mainstream science that ends up being reported in the major reports by IPCC, which is the body of the UN that deals with climate change science. So as such, some of the reports by IPCC, which are the basis for all climate discussions in conferences such as the Paris one of 2015, doesn't really include these climatic feedback loops, and perhaps doesn't make the case for keeping the temperature below 2 degrees strongly enough, or perhaps it is a failure of it has been often said that it's just a failure of communication. There is just no way we can make people understand what it's going to be like if these feedback loops kick in. Climate change is a much more difficult threat to visualize than a nuclear disaster, if you like.
Doesn't it beg us to take more action then, though? Because if you don't know the risk, and the downside risk is potentially catastrophic but not well understood, it behooves you to act. Because if you act, you make the atmosphere better, you create jobs with a Green New Deal, you just make the world a better place. And if you don't act, you potentially have catastrophic outcomes. So does it, like, if you're going to make a decision, you kind of must act?
Yeah, I think if you compare it to, say, a nuclear conflict, so none of us in this call, or even like those who are in government, feels personally responsible for climate change in a way. Whereas, say, President Truman back in 1944, 45, did feel personally responsible for dropping a nuclear bomb on Japan. And this is one thing. The other thing is that the threat is not immediate, like it's not like a bomb that drops and it's an immediate catastrophe. It's more of a slow. It's going to be slow until it gets very fast, but by that point, it's going to be too late.
So do you think it's kind of cognitive biases and communication are making the world not act on what is essentially a problem where we must act?
Yeah, I think it's we need really smart people to start thinking about better ways to communicate it. But it's hard in a context where, as you say, we can't even agree on the facts, and then you just need like random Republican scientists publishing whatever papers to support whatever facts.